I wonder what you are like with directions. If you're lost, perhaps the sat-nav in the car isn't working and you can't work out where on earth you are on that glove box, that map you found in the glove box that's been sitting there for years and years and probably doesn't have the road on it anyway. What do you do? There is a cliche that men don't like to stop to ask for directions. Now, I'm not sure whether that's really accurate, but I must admit that I'm not very good when people tell me directions to places. And I often forget the first instruction, or at least I forget what they've said after the first instruction of turn right at the White Horse. I'm much better with visual directions, with a map or indeed just a sketch of the route I should be following. But rather helpfully, in today's gospel, the need for remembering when to turn left and right is eliminated by the promise that the crooked roads will be made straight. And there's no need to worry about potholes, as the rough ways will be made smooth. Though I'm not entirely sure that Isaiah is talking about the actual surface of the route. Indeed, we're not talking about that sort of direction at all. We're not talking about the sort of direction for which a sat-nav might be useful. This is a different sort of route. But directions are still involved, albeit spiritual directions. This morning's gospel passage stops before we find out the nature and content of John's teaching, because that's not the reason it's included in the Advent readings. No, these will have to wait for another time, as today what is important is that John is the messenger sent ahead, rather like a vehicle sent ahead to clear the way for a large lorry. He's pointing to something much more impactful that's on its way. He's telling those who hear him that the Lord is on the way. Now, it might seem strange to have this passage in the lead up to Christmas, as if we continue reading, in a few verses we'll see that Jesus is not a baby, but is already 30 years old and is about to ask John to baptize him. Surely this is a reading we should have after Christmas when we mark the baptism of Christ, or at the start of Lent as we think about Jesus and his time in the wilderness. Time, of course, when, unlike us, when we mark Lent and give up chocolate and alcohol, he fasted from very much more than that. So why do we have this reading now, in Advent? Last weekend at St. Peter's, the college where I recently started a new role as college chaplain, we had our Advent carol service, a service that starts with a reminder that Advent is a time of waiting for the first and the second coming of Christ. The first is well known to us and involves the many familiar images of the nativity story with a baby in all his vulnerability. But the second is perhaps less familiar, or is perhaps one that we prefer not to contemplate. We have a very graphic, albeit baffling, and at times horrific account in the book of Revelation. That also has a white horse in it, I seem to remember, but I'm sure that one wasn't a pub. Or perhaps you've seen medieval paintings portraying interpretations of the second coming. Many churches in the continent still have them, and there are a few that have been rediscovered in this country, despite many having been destroyed in the aftermath of the Reformation. These are often called doom paintings, as they show images of the doom that awaits those that sin. A focus on the judgment promised at the second coming, as set out in some passages of the Gospels, or indeed in Revelation. But what I want us to think about today is why we are waiting and what we do in the meantime. As I say, Advent is not just a preparation for looking back at an event 2,000 years ago, but also looking forward to an event at some unspecified time in the future, but an event for which we should be watching and waiting, and for which we should be prepared. Think about the story of the bridesmaids who forgot to bring spare oil for their lamps, and so couldn't get in when the bridegroom arrived later than they had expected. They were not prepared. And it's very easy for us to get wrapped up in the busyness of our lives. Advent is a time for us to pause, to reflect, and to prepare for this second coming, which might be this year, or might not. We just don't know. Except part of it can be this year. It can be now. It can even be this morning, this hour, this minute, if you're open to it. Now, what's he going on about, I hear you wonder as you sit there. I'm not talking about the second coming as described in the book of Revelation, with earthquakes and fire and a rage of confusing numbers of things. I'm talking about what is at the heart of the message quoted from Isaiah in this morning's gospel. And all the people will see God's salvation. And all the people will see God's salvation. Okay, so what's going on here? What does it mean to see God's salvation? Now, I have a little bit of a problem. As I sat down to write this, to really explain what's going on, I need to talk you through the whole sweep of the story of God's people, from the creation story through their time in Egypt to the repeated turning from God in the book of Judges, to the failures of Saul, the king one, not the road to Damascus one, the failures of Saul to being faithful to God, to the breaking apart into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, to the repeated failings of various kings in the books of Kings and Chronicles, to the fall first of Israel then Judah, the destruction of the first temple, the one built by Solomon, and the exile to Babylon, to the rebuilding of the city walls under the direction of Nehemiah, and through the ignored warnings, the ignored repeatedly warnings of the prophets. Basically, we need to take on board the whole story up to the birth of a baby in Bethlehem around 4 BC. This is a story of broken relationships, and though there is repeated realization that the relationship has been broken, and there is a sort of repentance for this, the turning back to God has always been short-lived. Now, I'm sorry, for a moment, I'm going to need to get a little bit theological. Well, actually, you're going to need to get a little bit theological. You might recollect in the first account of the creation story in Genesis, yes, Genesis has 2 accounts of the creation story, but in the first one we're told, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So my question for you is, what do you think created in the image of God means? Now, I don't think it can mean that I am an exact photographic copy of God. How can I be? Because if I am, then how can you also each be an exact photocopy of God? Because we all look so different. And indeed, I look very different to how I did 10, 20, 30 years ago. Furthermore, how can both male and female be an exact photographic copy of God? No, I don't think that's what it means to be created in the image of God. Some scholars, one of them being Tom Wright, former Bishop of Durham, think that the image of God tells us that we, humanity, were created to be reflections of God and of God's nature. Perhaps thinking of us as being like mirrors might help with the analogy. But just as mirrors can become distorted or clouded, over time humanity became a poor reflection of God and of God's nature. It started all the way back in the Garden of Eden and has continued each time humanity has turned away from God, trusting in its own importance and greatness and reliance. Think about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he congratulates himself for the greatness of Babylon in the story of Daniel. You see, this turning away from God has continued throughout the Old Testament, again and again and again. Furthermore, we can never be God. Just as a mirror is never the thing that it reflects, we can never be God. But if we're not clouded or distorted, we can reflect God to those we encounter. But as I say, this mirror had become distorted and clouded. It no longer reflected God. Some parts of the image might just about shine through, but overall the image had become obscured by the distractions of false gods. Think about the golden calf that we hear about in the Exodus story, or our own self-importance. Nebuchadnezzar again. We needed a reset. Continuing the mirror analogy, we needed to be taught how to more truly reflect God. Time doesn't allow an exploration of whether the human incarnation of God was always part of God's plan, but what is clear from the reading from Malachi or from the passage we heard quoted from Isaiah this morning, or indeed from the message of John the Baptist, what is clear from all of them is that someone would come to show us God's salvation. Someone would come to enable us to restore the trueness and clarity of our mirrors. Someone would come to restore the relationship of walking and dwelling with God that we had lost in the Garden of Eden. You might think ahead to the end of the book of Revelation, where we're told, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them." At the end of Revelation, we have that restoration. God comes down to earth and dwells among us again. But Jesus, through his living with us, through his teaching, through his death and resurrection, he enables us to restore our reflectiveness, to restore our relationship, to restore the perfection of creation. That's what Jesus is coming for. Jesus is coming to save us from our distortions. And this is what we're waiting for in Advent. With the prophets, we are waiting for the first coming, something that happened in the past. We're still waiting for the second coming, something that will happen in the future. But through following Jesus' teaching, through embracing the way of life he shows us, through following his path, we can once again reflect the glory of God and of Jesus to those around us. Something we could choose to do now, today, this hour, this minute. Advent is a time for a reflective reset, a pause in the busyness we create for ourselves at Christmas, so that we can refocus on what the incarnation really means. I wonder, Will you use Advent to work on cleaning your metaphorical mirror so that you are ready to reflect the glory of God? Amen.
Reminder of what's happening this week and in the next couple of weeks. This afternoon at 5 o'clock, Wendover Choral Society have got their concert. They've got a new musical director, and I gather it's all been great fun. So certainly we're coming along and looking forward to it. Tomorrow's Sparklers. Thursday, we've got our usual communion service at 10 o'clock. And that's going to be followed by Christmas singing from the Year 2 children from John Hampden Infant School. So even if you don't want to come at 10, come along at half past and hear the children singing, bring some festive joy. Next Saturday, it's the Wendover Singers Christmas concert, which I understand is already sold out. So I'm sorry if you haven't got a ticket. That's not going to be possible to come to that. Next Sunday is the third Sunday of Advent, and 10:45. And then at 3 o'clock, we've got Christingle. So it's our Connect, Create and Celebrate service. I have to remember the 3 C's. So, that's the service that's been going for a couple of months, but it's got Christingle in, so anybody is welcome. The service isn't just for children and families, the service is for everybody, but most particularly Christingle. So come along then if you'd like to come to that. And then when we get to 2 weeks' time, the 22nd, we will just have one service at 10 o'clock, and then there will be the carol service at 7, and looking into the next week, on Christmas Eve, 4 o'clock will be our outdoor nativity, 11:30 our midnight service, and then Christmas Day, 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock. Thank you for those who've given to the tree. If you want to bring something in and haven't already, could that come in tomorrow, please? Because then it's been delivered, or collected rather, on Wednesday. I think that's everything. It's always great that we get our food bank collection. They're particularly looking for Christmassy things that they can give to families for Christmas. So again, if you're able to donate, and the box is just inside the door there. Thank you.